Alrighty, we are ready to get cracking. Sorry for the late start. We're getting better. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and today we're going to be reading more of Permutation City by one Greg Egan, whom I have never fanboyed over before in my life. That's a lie. That is irony or sarcasm. I fanboy over them on the regular for good reason, I feel. They are intellectually stimulating. I find them stimulating to read. There. I said it. I'm stimulatable. You heard him, ladies. And gents, I'm stimulatable. Here we go. So previously on. Previously. Oh, thanks for tuning in, Liz Angel. You are incredibly regular. Now. You are a fixture, even. Thanks for tuning in. Let's see. Previously on, we had more of the metaphysics or the philosophical discussion of what's going on with copies. Let's see. Um, this Thomas Riemann guy is at least intrigued in the idea that Durham is bringing to the table, even though he is one of the copies who is so exorbitantly wealthy that he's got his own private hardware infrastructure to run on, so would be a lot less likely to be affected by uh, copies being cut out of the global um, QIPS quips market, which is the quadrillions of. Oh, I just found this last week and now I have to find it again. I think it's quadrillions of instructions per second. Basically, you buy shares of computer time uh, over the open internet. Where are you? It'd be really good if I could find that again and memorize it for once. Memorizing it would be very good. I think it's towards the end of that chapter. Yes. Yes, the Quips Exchange, the marketplace where processing power was bought and sold. Quadrillions of instructions per second. Yes, I should probably put an extra baby bookmark right there for all the times I'm going to forget that, which is going to be every single week at this rate. Um, Maybe we'll remember later. I don't know. Anyway, so Maria de Luca's mother is dying. I can't remember what exactly it is, but the prognosis is dire with a capital not good. Um, but her mother does not want to be brain scanned and uploaded as a copy. This is not something she wants. Um, Maria can't quite understand this. She blames the religion that her mother is a part of, which I think is like the god of nothing, something like that. But her mother's just like, it's not for me. It's got nothing to do with my religion. What is it called? What is the name of that religion? Oh, the Church of the God Who Makes No Difference. There we go. It's basically it's basically I would compare them to the Unitarian Universalists, but they're even more aggressively agnostic than that. um, Far more aggressively agnostic. Uh, so they don't really believe in much of anything. They're just kind of an organized institution. Trappings of religion, but not much else. They're a bit more honest about the whole deal. It's more of a social organization. Anyway, hopefully we'll have no technical issues this week. I've got more monitors up to see if I'll catch it quicker at least. We'll find out. Ooh, that's running a little hot. I wonder if I should be worried about that. Anyway, hopefully no further problems. Let's see, Paul Durham. Was there anything which happened with Paul Durham? Not really. Things are moving slowly in that regard, but we are going places with that. Anyway, without further yammering or yapperating, let's get a crackerating on Chapter 10 of Permutation City by Greg Egan. Chapter 10 Remit Not Paucity, November 2050. Maria arrived at the cafe 15 minutes early, to find Durham already there, seated at a table close to the entrance. She was surprised, but relieved. With the long wait she'd been expecting suddenly cancelled, she'd had no time to grow nervous. Durham spotted her as she walked in. They shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, ordered coffee from the table's touch-screen menus. Seeing Durham in the flesh did nothing to contradict the impression he'd made by phone. Middle-aged, quiet, conservatively dressed, not exactly the not exactly the archetypical Autoverse junkie. Maria said, I always thought I was the only Autoverse review subscriber living in Sydney. I've been in touch with Ian Summers in Hobart a couple of times, but I never realized there was anyone so close. Durham was apologetic. There's no reason why you would have heard of me. I'm afraid I've always confined myself to reading the articles. I've never contributed anything or participated in the conferences. I don't actually work in the Autoverse myself. I don't have the time or the skills, to be honest. Maria absorbed that, trying not to appear too startled. It was like hearing someone admit that they studied chess but never played the game. But I've followed progress in the field very closely, and I can certainly appreciate what you've done with A. Lamberti, perhaps even more so than some of your fellow practitioners. I think I see it in a rather broader context. You mean cellular automata in general? Cellular automata, artificial life. They're your main interests? Yes. But not as a participant? Maria tried to imagine this man as a patron of the artificial life scene, magnanimously sponsoring promising young practitioners. Lorenzo the Magnificent to the Botticellis and Michelangelos of cellular automaton theory. It wouldn't wash. Even if the idea wasn't intrinsically ludicrous, he just didn't look that rich. The coffee arrived. Durham started paying for both of them, but when Maria protested, he let her pay for herself without an argument, which made her feel far more at ease. As the robot trolley slid away, she got straight to the point. You say you're interested in funding research that builds on my results with A. Lamberti. Is there any particular direction? Yes, I have something very specific in mind. Durham hesitated. I still don't know the best way to put this, but I want you to help me prove a point. I want you to construct a seed for a biosphere. Maria said nothing. She wasn't even sure she'd heard him correctly. A seed for a biosphere was terraforming jargon for all the plant and animal species required to render a sterile but theoretically habitable planet ecologically stable. She'd never come across the phrase in any other context. Durham continued. I want you to design a prebiotic environment, a planetary surface, if you'd like to think of it that way, and one simple organism which you believe would be capable, in time, of evolving into a multitude of species and filling all the potential ecological niches. An environment? So you want a virtual reality landscape? Maria tried not to look disappointed. Had she seriously expected to be paid to work in the Autoverse? With microscopic primordial life? Some kind of pre-Cambrian theme park where the users can shrink to the size of algae and inspect their earliest ancestors? Earliest ancestors? For all her distaste for patchwork VR, Maria found herself almost warming to the idea. If Durham was offering her the chance to supervise the whole project, and the funds to do the job properly, it would be 1,000 times more interesting than any of the tedious VR contracts she'd had in the past, and a lot more lucrative. But Durham said, "No, please, forget about virtual reality. I want you to design an organism and an environment in the Autoverse which would have the properties I've described. And forget about Precambrian algae. I don't expect you to recreate ancestral life on Earth, translate it into Autoverse chemistry, if such a thing would even be possible. I want you to construct a system with the same potential." Maria was now thoroughly confused. "When you mentioned a planetary surface, I thought you meant a full-scale virtual landscape, a few dozen square kilometers. But if you're talking about the Autoverse, you mean a fissure in a rock on a seabed? Something like that? Something vaguely analogous to a microenvironment on the early Earth? Something a bit more natural than a culture dish full of two different sugars?" Durham said, "I'm sorry, I'm not making myself very clear. Of course you'll want to try out the seed organism in a number of microenvironments. That's the only way you'll be able to predict with any confidence that it would actually survive, mutate, adapt, flourish. Uh, but once that's established, I'll want you to describe the complete picture. Specify an entire planetary environment which the Autoverse could support, and in which the seed would be likely to evolve into higher life forms." Maria hesitated. She was beginning to wonder if Durham had any idea of the scale on which things were done in the Autoverse. "What exactly do you mean by a planetary environment?" "Whatever you think is reasonable. Say 30 million square kilometers." He laughed. "Don't have a heart attack. I don't expect you to model the whole thing atom by atom. I do realize that all the computers on Earth couldn't handle much more than a tide pool. I just want you to describe the essential features. You could do that in a couple of terabytes, probably less. It wouldn't take much to sum up the topography. Doesn't matter what the specific shape of every mountain and valley and beach is. All you need is a statistical description, a few relevant fractal dimensions. The meteorology and the geochemistry, for want of a better word, will be a little more complex, but I think you know what I'm getting at. You could summarize everything that matters about a prebiotic planet with a relatively small amount of data. I don't expect you to hand over a giant Autoverse grid which contains every atom and every grain of sand." Maria said, "No, of course not." This was getting stranger by the minute. "But why specify a whole planet in any form?" "The size of the environment and the variation in climate and terrain are important factors. Details like that will affect the number of different species which arise in isolation and later migrate and interact. They certainly made a difference to the Earth's evolutionary history, so they may or may not be crucial, but they're hardly irrelevant." Maria said carefully, "That's true, but nobody will ever be able to run a system that big in the Autoverse, so what's the point of describing it? On Earth, the system is that big. We're stuck with it. The only way to explain the entire fossil record and the current distribution of species is to look at things on a planetary scale. Migration has happened. It has to be taken into account. But in the Autoverse, it hasn't happened, and it never will. Effects like that will always be completely hypothetical." Durham said, "Hypothetical? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean the results can't be considered, can't be imagined, can't be argued about. Think of this whole project as an aid to a thought experiment, a sketch of a proof." "A proof of what?" "That Autoverse life could, in theory, be as rich and complex as life on Earth." Maria shook her head. "I can't prove that. Modeling a few thousand generations of bacterial evolution in a few microenvironments." Durham waved a hand reassuringly. "Don't worry, I don't have unrealistic expectations. I said a sketch of a proof. But maybe even that's putting it too strongly. I just want suggestive evidence. I want the best blueprint, the best recipe you can come up with for a world embedded in the autoverse, which might eventually develop complex life. A set of results on the short-term evolutionary genetics of the seed organism, plus an outline of an environment in which that organism could, plausibly, evolve into higher forms. It's impossible to run a planet-sized world, but that's no reason not to contemplate what such a world would be like, to answer as many questions as can be answered, and to make the whole scenario as concrete as possible. I want you to create a package so thorough, so detailed, that if someone handed it to you out of the blue, it would be enough, not to prove anything, but to persuade you that true biological diversity could arise in the autoverse. Maria laughed. I'm already persuaded of that myself. I just doubt that there could ever be a watertight proof. Then imagine persuading someone a little more skeptical. Who exactly did you have in mind? Calvin and his mob? If you like. Maria suddenly wondered if Durham was someone she should have known after all, someone who'd published in other areas of the artificial life scene. Why else would he be concerned with that debate? She should have done a much wider literature search. She said, so what it comes down to is you want to present the strongest possible case that deterministic systems like the autoverse can generate a biology as complex as real-world biology, that all the subtleties of real-world physics and quantum indeterminacy aren't essential. And to deal with the objection that a complex biology might only arise in a complex environment, you want a description of a suitable planet that could exist in the autoverse, if not for the minor inconvenience that the hardware that could run it will almost certainly never be built. That's right. Maria hesitated. She didn't want to argue this bizarre project out of existence, but she could hardly take it on if she wasn't clear about its goals. But when it's all said and done, how much will this really add to the results with A. Lamberti? In one sense, not a lot, Durham conceded. As you said, there can never be a proof. There can never be a proof. Natural selection is natural selection, and you've shown that it can happen in the autoverse. Maybe that should be enough. But don't you think a carefully designed thought experiment with an entire planet is a bit more evocative than any number of real experiments with petri dishes? Don't underestimate the need to appeal to people's imaginations. Maybe you can see all the consequences of your work already. Other people might need to have them spelled out explicitly. Maria couldn't argue with any of that, but who handed out research grants on the basis of what was evocative? So, which university? Durham cut her off. I'm not an academic. This is just an interest of mine. A hobby, like it is with you. I'm an insurance salesman in real life. But how could you get funding without I'm paying for this myself? He laughed. Don't worry, I can afford it. If you take me up on this, you're not going to be short-changed. I can promise you that. And I know it's unusual for an amateur to subcontract. But like I said, I don't work in the autoverse. It would take me 5 years to learn to It would take me 5 years to learn to do myself what I'm asking of you. You'll be free to publish all of this under your own name, of course. All I ask is a footnote acknowledging financial support. Maria didn't know what to say. Lorenzo the insurance salesman? A private citizen, not even an autoverse junkie, was offering to pay her to carry out the most abstract piece of programming imaginable, not simulating a non-existent world, but preparing a simulation that would never be performed. She could hardly be disdainful of anyone for throwing their hard-earned money away on pointless autoverse research, but everything that had driven her to do that herself revolved around first-hand experience. However much intellectual pleasure it had given her, the real obsession, the real addiction, was a matter of putting on the gloves and reaching into that artificial space. Durham handed her a ROM chip. There are some detailed notes here, including a few ideas of mine, but don't feel obliged to follow any of them. What I want is whatever you think is most likely to work, not what's closest to my preconceptions. And there's a contract, of course. Have your legal expert system look it over. If you're not happy with anything, I'm pretty flexible. Thank you. Durham stood. "I'm sorry to cut this short, but I'm afraid I have another appointment. Please, read the notes, think it all through. Call me when you've made a decision." After he'd left, Maria sat at the table, staring at the black epoxy rectangle in her palm, trying to make sense of what had happened. Babbage had designed the analytical engine with no real prospect of seeing it constructed in his lifetime. Space travel enthusiasts had been designing interstellar craft down to every last nut and bolt since the 1960s. Terraforming advocates were constantly churning out comprehensive feasibility studies for schemes unlikely to be attempted for 100 years or more. Why? As aids to thought experiments, as sketches of proofs. And if Durham, who'd never even worked in the autoverse, had an infinitely grander vision of its long-term possibilities than she had, then maybe she'd always been too close to it, too wrapped up in the tedious contingencies to see what he'd seen. Except that this wasn't about long-term possibilities. The computer that could run an autoverse world would be far bigger than the planet it was modeling. If such a device was ever to be constructed, however far into the future, there'd have to be far better reasons for building it than this. It wasn't a question of a visionary born a generation or two before his time. Autoverse ecology was an entirely theoretical notion, and it always would be. The project was a thought experiment in the purest sense. It was also too good to be true. The Autoverse addict's dream contract. But short of some senseless, capricious hoax, why should Durham lie to her? Maria pocketed the chip and left the cafe, not knowing whether to feel skeptical and pessimistic or elated and guilty. Guilty because Durham, if he was genuine, if he honestly planned to pay her real money for this glorious, senseless exercise, had to be a little insane. If she took this job, she'd be taking advantage of him, exploiting his strange madness. Maria let Aidan into the house reluctantly. They usually met at his place, or on neutral ground, but he'd been visiting a friend nearby, and she could think of no excuse to turn him away. She caught a glimpse of the red, cloudless sunset behind him, and the open doorway let in the hot concrete smell of dusk, the whir of evening traffic. After 7 hours cloistered in her room, reading Durham's notes for his Autoverse Garden of Eden, the street outside seemed strange, almost shocking, charged with the 2 billion-year gulf between Earth's equivalent moment of primordial fecundity and all the bizarre consequences. She walked ahead of Aidan down the entrance hall and switched on the light in the living room while he propped his cycle against the stairs. Alone, the house suited her perfectly, but it took only one more person to make it seem cramped. He caught up with her and said, "I heard about your mother." "How? Who told you?" "Ah, Joe knows one of your cousins in Newcastle. Angela, is that her name?" He was leaning sideways against the doorframe, arms folded. Maria said, "Why don't you come right in if you're coming in?" He said, "I'm sorry. Is there anything I can do?" She shook her head. She'd been planning to ask him how much he could lend her to help with the scan, but she couldn't raise the subject, not yet. He'd ask, innocently, if Francesca was certain that she wanted to be scanned, and the whole thing would degenerate into an argument about her right to choose a natural death, as if there was any real choice without the money for a scan. Maria said, "I saw her yesterday. She's handling it pretty well, but I don't want to talk about it right now." Aidan nodded, then detached himself from the doorway and walked up to her. They kissed for a while, which was comforting in a way, but Aidan soon had an erection, and Maria was in no mood for sex. Even at the best of times, it took a willing suspension of disbelief, a conscious decision to bury her awareness of the biological clockwork driving her emotions. And right now, her head was still buzzing with Durham's suggestion for building a kind of latent diploidism into A. Lamberti, which a propensity to mistakenly make extra copies of chromosomes, which might eventually pave the way to sexual reproduction and all of its evolutionary advantages. Aidan pulled free and went and sat in one of the armchairs. Maria said, I think I've finally got some work, if I didn't dream the whole thing. That's great. Who for? She described her meeting with Durham, the commission, the seed. Aidan said, So you don't even know what he gets out of this, except not quite proving some obscure intellectual point about evolution? He laughed, incredulous. How will you know if you've not quite proved it well enough? And what if Durham disagrees? The contract is all in my favor. He pays the money into a trust fund before I even start. All I have to do is make a genuine effort to complete the project within 6 months, and if there's any dispute, he's legally bound to accept an independent adjudicator's decision on what constitutes a genuine effort. The expert system I hired gave the contract a triple A rating. Aidan still looked skeptical. You should get a second opinion. Half the time those things don't even agree with each other, let alone predict what would happen in court. Anyway, if it all goes smoothly, what do you end up with? $30,000? Not bad for 6 months' work, plus computing time up to another 30,000, billed directly to him. Yeah? How can he afford all this? He's an insurance salesman. If he's good, he could be making, I don't know, 200 grand a year? Which is 120 after tax, and he's paying out 60 on this shit? Yes. You have a problem with it? It doesn't exactly leave him poverty-stricken, and he could be earning twice as much for all I know, not to mention savings, investments, tax dodges. His personal finances are none of my business. Once the money's in the trust fund, he can go bankrupt for all I care. I still get paid if I finish the job. That's good enough for me. Aidan shook his head. I just can't see why he thinks it's worth it. There are God knows how many thousand copies in existence right now, running half the biggest corporations in the world, in case you hadn't noticed. And this man wants to spend $60,000 proving that artificial life can go beyond bacteria? Maria groaned. We've been through this before. The Autoverse is not virtual reality. Copies are not the human equivalent of A. Lamberti. They're a cheat. They're a mess. They do what they're meant to do very efficiently. But there's no underlying logic to them. Every part of their body obeys a different set of ad hoc rules. Okay, it would be insane to try to model an entire human body on a molecular level, but if you're interested in the way fundamental physics affects biology, copies are irrelevant because they have no fundamental physics. The behavior of a copy's neurons doesn't arise from any deeper laws. It's just a matter of some rules for neurons, which are based directly on what's known about neurons in the human body. But in the human body, that behavior is a consequence of the laws of physics, acting on billions of molecules. With copies, we've cheated for the sake of efficiency. There are no molecules and no laws of physics. We've just put in the net results, the biology, by hand. And that offends your aesthetic sensibilities? That's not the point. Copies have their place, and when the time comes, I'd rather be a software mongrel than dead. All I'm saying is they're useless for telling you what kind of physics can support what kind of life. A burning question for our time. Maria felt herself flush with anger, but she said evenly, Maybe not. I just happen to find it interesting. And apparently Paul Durham does too. And maybe it's too abstract a question to qualify as science. Maybe working in the Autoverse is nothing but pure mathematics, or philosophy, or art. But you don't seem to have any qualms about spending a year in Seoul practicing your own useless art form at the Korean taxpayers' expense. It's a private university. Korean students' expense, then. I never said there was anything wrong with you taking the job. I just don't want to see you get screwed if this man turns out to be lying. What could he possibly have to gain by lying? I don't know, but I still don't see what he has to gain if he's telling the truth. He shrugged. But if you're happy, I'm happy. Maybe it'll all be okay. And I know, the way things are going, you can't afford to be picky. Picky? Maria started laughing. Discussing this on Aidan's terms was ridiculous. Durham wasn't stringing her along, wasting her time. He was absolutely serious. His notes proved that. 300 pages. Months of work. He'd taken the plan as far as he could, short of learning the intricacies of the Autoverse himself. And maybe she still didn't understand his motives. But maybe there was nothing to be understood. When she'd been immersed in his notes, there'd been no mystery at all. On its own terms, Durham's plan was natural, obvious. An end in itself, requiring no dreary explanation rooted in the world of academic glory and monetary gain. Aidan said, "What's so funny?" "Never mind." He shifted in the chair and looked at her oddly. "Well, at least you won't have to spend all your time in Seoul looking for work now. That would have been a bore." "I'm not going to Seoul." "You're joking." She shook her head. "What's the problem? You can do this job anywhere, can't you?" "Probably. Yes. I just—" Maria felt a twinge of uncertainty. He seemed genuinely hurt. He'd made it clear that he'd go without her if he had to, but that was understandable. Composer in residence was his perfect job, and she had nothing to weigh against that, nothing to lose by accompanying him. He might have put his position more diplomatically, instead of making her feel like optional baggage, but that was neither proof that he was trying to drive her away nor an unforgivable crime in itself. He was tactless sometimes. She could live with that. "What's wrong with you? You'd love it in Seoul. I know you would." "You know you would." She said, "I'd love it too much. There'd be too many distractions. This project is going to be hard work, the hardest thing I've ever done, and if I can't give it all my attention, it's going to be impossible." It had started as an ad lib excuse, but it was true. She had 6 months, if not to build a world, at least to sketch one. If she didn't eat, sleep, and breathe it, it would never come together. It would never come to life. Aidan snorted. "That's ludicrous. You don't even have to write a program that runs. You said yourself, as long as you make a reasonable effort, whatever you hand over will be good enough. What's Durham going to say? 'Sorry, but I don't think this slime mold would ever invent the wheel.'" "Getting it right matters to me." Aidan said nothing. Then, "If you want to stay behind because of your mother, why can't you just say so?" Maria was startled. "Because it's not true." He stared at her angrily. I was going to offer to stay here with you, but I was going to offer to stay here with you, but you didn't want to talk about it." Maria untangled that. "That's what you came here to tell me? That if I planned to stay in Sydney because of Francesca, you'd turn down the job in Seoul?" "Yes." He said it as if it should have been obvious to her all along. "She's dying. Do you think I'd walk off and leave you to cope with that alone? What kind of shit do you think I am?" "She's not dying. She's going to be scanned." But she didn't say that. "Francesca doesn't care if I go or stay. I offered to move in with her, but she doesn't want to be looked after by anyone, let alone by me." "Then come to Seoul." "Why, exactly? So you won't feel bad about leaving me? That's what it all comes down to, isn't it? Your peace of mind." Aidan thought about that for a while. Then he said, "All right, fuck you. Stay." He got to his feet and walked out of the room. Maria listened to him fumbling with his cycle, then opening the front door, slamming it closed. She tidied up in the kitchen, checked the locks, switched off the lights. Then she went upstairs and lay on her bed, leaving the room in darkness, trying to picture the likely course of events over the next few weeks. Aidan would phone before he left, trying to patch things up, but she could see how easy it would be, now, to break things off permanently. And now that it had reached that stage, it seemed like the obvious thing to do. She wasn't upset or relieved, just calm. It always made her feel that way, burning bridges, driving people away, simplifying her life. She'd left the terminal switched on after reading Durham's ROM. The screen was blank and supposedly pure black, but as her eyes adapted to the dark, she could see it glowing a faint gray. Every now and then there was a brief flash at a random point on the screen, a pixel activated by background radiation, struck by a cosmic ray. She watched the flashes, like a slow rain falling on a window to another world, until she fell asleep. Chapter 11. Remit Not Paucity. January 2051. Who is this guy? Give me a sec. We got introduced to some new characters last time, and I can't remember if this guy is one of them. One sec. Nope. Okay, but we are going to have one of those recurring characters. Malcolm Carter presented as a tall, solid, vigorous-looking man in late middle age. And in fact, he was 58, so his visitor's body might easily have been styled directly on his real one. Peer remembered seeing photographs of Carter in the early 30s, when he rose to prominence as one of the first architect programmers to concentrate on the needs of copies, rather than catering to the human visitors who used virtual environments merely for work or entertainment. Visitors had ended up hiring him too, though, visitors like Kate, who were on their way in. And Kate had moved in a similar orbit then, a young computer artist snatched out of obscurity in Oregon and adopted by the San Francisco glitterati at about the same time as Carter's own ascent from a small Arizona software house. Peer wasn't sure he would have recognized the man from those old magazine shots, but then nobody continued to look the way they'd looked in their 30s if they could possibly help it. Carter shook hands with Peer and nodded at Kate. Peer wondered, curious but not really jealous, if they were greeting each other a little more warmly in a private detour from the version of the meeting he was seeing. They were standing in a spacious reception area, the walls and high ceiling decorated with a motif of tiered concentric circles molded into the cream-colored plaster. The floor tiles in black and white diamonds. This was Carter's publicly listed VR address. Anyone at all could call the number and come here. That's in quotes. The room spawned several versions for separate callers, though. Peer and Kate had taken steps to arrive together, but there had been no risk of them accidentally bumping into one of Carter's, or Durham's, wealthy clients. Carter said, "I hope you don't mind if we keep this brief and to the point. I don't like to use inducers for more than 24 hours at a stretch." Peer said, "It's good of you to make the time to see us at all." He cursed himself silently. He was contemplating paying this man a substantial portion of his entire wealth, and trusting him with the fate of an autonomous version of his own consciousness. He had a right to an audience. Still, at a slow down of 60. Carter, if it really was Carter and not just a convincing mask, pointed out a door at the end of the room. "There's a rough sketch of the city through there, if you want to take the tour later on. Just call out for a guide if you need one. But I expect the city itself's not your main concern. What you really want to know is, can I fit you safely into the cracks?" Peer glanced at Kate. She remained silent. She was already convinced. This was all for his benefit. Carter held out a hand toward the middle of the room. "See that fountain?" A 10-meter wide marble wedding cake, topped with a winged cherub wrestling a serpent, duly appeared. Water cascaded down from a gushing wound in the cherub's neck. Carter said, "It's being computed by redundancies in the sketch of the city. I can extract the results because I know exactly where to look for them, but nobody else would have a hope in hell of picking them out." Peer walked up to the fountain. Even as he approached, he noticed that the spray was intangible. When he dipped his hand in the water around the base, he felt nothing, and the motion he made with his fingers left the foaming surface unchanged. They were spying on the calculations, not interacting with them. The fountain was a closed system. Carter said, "In your case, of course, nobody'll need to know the results, except you, and you'll know them because you'll be them." Peer replied, almost without thinking, "Not me, my clone." "Whatever." Carter clapped his hands, and a multicolored, three-dimensional lattice appeared, floating in the air above the fountain. "This is a schematic of part of the software running the sketch of the city. Each cube represents a process. Packets of data, those blips of colored light, flow between them." Let me double check, make sure this is him talking. Yes, it is. "There's nothing so crude as a subset of processes dedicated to the fountain. Every individual process, and every individual packet of data, is involved with some aspect of the city. But there are some slightly inefficient calculations going on here and there, and some redundant pieces of information being exchanged." pinpricks in a smattering of the cubes, and some of the data glowed bright blue. One of the simplest tricks is to use a vector when only a direction is needed, when the magnitude of the vector is irrelevant. Perfectly reasonable operations on the vector, entirely justified in their own context, incidentally perform arithmetic on the magnitude. But that's just one technique. There are dozens of others. He clapped his hands again, and everything but the blue highlights vanished. The diagram reformed, the scattered processes coming together into a compact grid. The point is, the fountain gets computed along with the city, without any of the software explicitly stealing time for a parasitic task. Every line of every program makes sense in terms of computing the city. Pierce said, and if Durham runs your code through an optimizer, which rescales all the unnecessary vectors, trims away all the inefficiencies? Carter shook his head. I don't believe he'd meddle with the code at all, but even if he does, optimizers can only track things so far. In the full version of the city, the results of your calculations will propagate so widely that it would take months for any program to deduce that the data is not actually needed somewhere, that it ultimately makes no difference to the legitimate inhabitants. He grinned. Optimizing anything to do with copies is a subtle business. You must have heard about the billionaire recluse who wanted to run as fast as possible, even though he never made contact with the outside world, so he fed his own code into an optimizer. After analyzing it for a year, the optimizer reported, "This program will produce no output," and spat out the optimized version, which did precisely nothing. Pierre laughed, although he'd heard the joke before. Carter said, the fact is, the city's so complex that there's so much going on that even if it had all been left to chance, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some quite sophisticated secondary computations taking place purely by accident. I haven't gone looking for them, though. It would burn up far too much processor time. And the same applies to anyone searching for you. It's not just a practical proposition. Why would anyone spend millions of dollars scanning for something which can do no harm? Let me try repeating that. Why would anyone spend millions of dollars scanning for something which can do no harm? Pierre gazed up at the blue schematic skeptically. Carter came across as if he knew what he was talking about, but a few plausible-looking graphics proved nothing. Carter seemed to read his mind. If you have any doubts, take a look at the software I used. A large, fat book appeared, floating in front of Pierre. This modifies Program A to surreptitiously carry out Program B, given A is sufficiently more algorithmically complex than B. What that means, exactly, is in the technical appendix. Try it out. Show it to your favorite expert system. Verify it any way you like. Pierre took hold of the book, squeezed it down to credit card size, and slipped it into the back pocket of his jeans. He said, "There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to do everything you claim. Piggyback us onto the city, hide us from searches, protect us from optimization. But why? What do you get out of this? What you're asking for is nothing compared to what Durham must be paying you. So why take the risk? Or do you screw all your clients as a matter of principle?" Carter chose to seem amused, not offended. The practice of skimming off a percentage of a construction project has a long, honorable tradition. All the more honorable if the client's needs aren't seriously compromised. In this case, there's also some elegant programming involving... What? 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 In this case, there's also some elegant programming involving double hyphen, worth doing for its Okay. So that's supposed to be involved, not involving. I'm not sure how that happened. One minor mistake I can forgive and overlook. He said, as he sat in judgment. Here we go. The practice of skimming off a percentage of a construction project is a long, honorable tradition. All the more honorable if the client's needs aren't seriously compromised. In this case, there's also some elegant programming involved, worth doing for its own sake. As for the money, I'm charging you enough to cover my costs. He exchanged a look with Kate, for Pierre's benefit, or he wouldn't have seen it. But in the end, I'm only making the offer as a favor, so if you think I'm going to cheat you, you're welcome to decline. Pierre changed tack. What if Durham is cheating his clients? You're only screwing them out of a few quips, But what if Durham doesn't plan to run the city at all, just vanish with the money? Have you ever seen his hardware? Have you used it? As the town burns down. Not my town burning down. Someone else's town. Good. No, not good. Bad. At least it's not here. Have you ever seen his hardware? Have you used it? No, but he never claimed, to me, that he had his own hardware. The version of the story I got is that the city's going to run on public networks. That's bullshit, of course. The copies funding him wouldn't wear that for a second. It's just a polite way of telling me that the hardware is none of my business. And as for vanishing with the money, from what I can deduce about his cash flow, he'll be lucky to break even on the project, which suggests to me that someone else entirely is handling the true financial arrangements. Durham is just a front man, and the real owner of the hardware will pay him for his troubles once the whole thing is wrapped up. The owner of what? This hypothetical breakthrough machine that nobody's laid eyes on? If he's persuaded Sanderson and Repetto to pay him, then you can be sure he's shown them something that he hasn't shown me. Peer was about to protest, but Carter's expression said, "Take it or leave it, believe what you like. I've done this much for my ex-lover, but the truth is I don't care if you're convinced or not." Carter excused himself. When he turned and walked away across the room, footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, Peer couldn't believe he would have hung around for the 15 real-time minutes it took to reach the exit. Not a busy man like that. In fact, he'd probably conducted 2 or 3 other meetings with copies while he'd been talking to them, dropping in and out of the conversation, leaving a mask to animate his features in his absence. Kate said, "What's the worst that can happen? If Durham is a con man, if the city's a hoax, what have we lost? All money can buy us is quips, and you're the one who's so sure that it doesn't matter how slowly we run." Peer scowled, still staring at the exit Carter had used, surprised to find himself reluctant to drag his gaze away. The door meant nothing to him. He said, "Half the charm of this lies in stealing a free ride, or bribing Carter to steal it for us. There's not much dignity in stowing away on a ship going nowhere." "You could choose not to care." "I don't want to do that. I don't pretend to be human, but I still have a core personality, and I don't want equanimity. Equanimity is death."
On the skyscraper,
On the skyscraper, I rid myself of distractions, and it's confined to that one context. When I emerge, I still have goals. I still have desires. He turned to her, reached out and brushed her cheek with his fingers. "You could choose not to care about security, or quips rates, weather control, the politics of computing. You could choose to view all the threatening noises of the outside world as so much flatulence. Then you wouldn't need or want to do this at all." Kate left the body he was touching where it was, but took a step backward in another just like it. Peer let his hand drop to his side.
she said, once I'm part of this billionaire city, I'll happily forget about the outside world, once I have all that money and influence devoted to my survival."
"Do you mean that'll be enough to satisfy you? Or do you intend making a conscious decision to be satisfied?" She smiled enigmatically, and Peer made a conscious decision to be moved by the sight. She said,
"I don't know yet. You'll have to wait and see."
Peer said nothing. He realized that, in spite of his doubts, he'd almost certainly follow her, and not just for the shock of creating a second version, not just for the sake of undermining his last anthropomorphic delusions. The truth was, he wanted to be with her. All of her. If he backed out and she went ahead, the knowledge that he'd passed up his one opportunity to have a version of himself accompany her would drive him mad. He wasn't sure if this was greed or affection, jealousy or loyalty, but he knew he had to be a part of whatever she experienced in there. It was an unsettling revelation. Peer took a snapshot of his state of mind. Kate gestured toward the door which led to the sketch of the city. Peer said, "Why bother with that? There'll be plenty of time to explore the real thing."
She looked at him oddly. "Don't you want to satisfy your curiosity, now and forever, for the one who'll stay behind?"
He thought about it,
then shook his head. "One clone'll see the finished city, one won't. Both'll share a past where they'd never even heard of the place. The clone outside, who never sees the city, will try to guess what it's like. The clone inside will run other environments, and sometimes he won't think about the city at all. When he does, sometimes he'll misremember it, and sometimes he'll dream about wildly distorted versions of what he's seen. I define all those moments as part of me. So, what is there to be curious about?" Kate. Kate said, "I love it when you go all doctrinaire on me." She stepped forward and kissed him. Then, as he reached out to hold her, she slipped away into yet another body, leaving him embracing nothing but dead weight. "Now shut up and let's go take a look." Pierre doubted that he'd ever know exactly why he'd died. No amount of agonized introspection, tortuous video postcard interrogation of ex-friends, or even expert system analysis of his final scan file had brought him any nearer to the truth. The gap was too wide to be bridged. The last 4 years of his corporeal life had been lost to him, and the events of the period seemed more like an ill-fated excursion into a parallel world than any mere episode of amnesia. The coroner had returned an open finding. Rock climbing accidents were rare, the best technology was almost foolproof, but David Hawthorne had scornfully eschewed all the mollycoddling refinements, including the black box implants which could have recorded the actions leading up to his death, if not the motives behind them. No pitons full of microchips, which could have performed ultrasound tomography of the cliff face and computed their own load-bearing capacity. No harness packed with intelligent crash balloons, which could have cushioned his 60-meter fall onto jagged rocks. No robot climbing partner, which could have carried him 20 kilometers over rugged terrain with a broken spine and delivered him into intensive care as if he'd floated there on a cloud of morphine. Pierre could empathize, to a degree. What was the point of being scanned, only to remain enslaved by an obsolete respect for the body's fragility? Having triumphed over mortality, how could he have gone on living as if nothing had changed? Every biological instinct, every common sense idea about the nature of survival had been rendered absurd. And he hadn't been able to resist the urge to dramatize the transformation. That didn't prove that he'd wanted to die. But whether his death had been pure misfortune, unequivocal suicide, or the result of some insanely dangerous stunt not, consciously, intended to be fatal, the 4 years out of date David Hawthorne had awakened in the virtual slums to realize that, personally, he'd given the prospect about as much serious consideration as that of awakening in purgatory. Whatever he'd come to believe in those missing years, whatever he'd imagined in his last few seconds of life on that limestone overhang, up until his final scan, he'd always pictured his virtual resurrection as taking place in the distant future, when either he'd be seriously wealthy, or the cost of computing would have fallen so far that money would scarcely matter. He'd been 46 years old, in perfect health, a senior executive with Insight plc, Europe's 25th largest marketing firm, second in charge of the interactive targeted mail division. Shudder. With care, he could have died at the age of 150, to become an instant member of the elite, perhaps, by then, in a cybernetic body barely distinguishable from the real thing. But having paid for the right not to fear death, at some level he must have confused the kind of abstract, literary, morally charged, beloved of fate immortality possessed by mythical heroes and virtuous believers in the afterlife with the highly specific free market version he'd actually signed up for. And whatever the convoluted psychological explanation for his death, in financial terms, the result was very simple. He'd died too soon. In a real-time week, a few subjective hours, he had gone from a model of flesh and blood in the lavish virtual apartment he'd bought at the time of his first scan to a disembodied consciousness observing his bunker. Even that hadn't been enough to let him cling to his role in the outside world. Full life insurance was not available to people who'd been scanned, let alone those who also indulged in dangerous recreations, and the coroner's verdict had even ruled out payment from the only overpriced, watered down substitute policy he'd been able to obtain. At a slowdown of 30, the lowest bunker to real time factor the income from his investments could provide, communication was difficult, and productive work was impossible. Even if he'd started burning up his capital to buy the exclusive use of a processor cluster, the time rate difference would have rendered him unemployable. Copies whose trust funds controlled massive shareholdings, deceased company directors who sat on unofficial boards which met twice a year and made 3 or 4 leisurely decisions, could live with the time dilated economics of slowdown. Hawthorne had died before achieving the necessary financial critical mass, let alone the kind of director emeritus status where he could be paid for nothing but his name on the company letterhead. Letterhead, sorry. As the reality of his situation sank in, he spiraled into the blackest depression. Any number of expensive, disabling diseases might have dragged him from upper middle class comfort into comparative poverty and isolation, but dying poor had an extra sting. That's poor in quotes. In corporeal life, he'd happily gone along with the consensus. Money is the deepest level of reality, ownership records as the definition of truth, while escaping most weekends to the manicured garden of the English countryside, camping beneath the clouds, clearing his head of the city's Byzantine fictions, reminding himself that he could have lived off the land. Vanishing into a forest mapped twice a day by Earthsat on a centimeter scale, surviving on the flesh of protected species, tearing the radio tracking collars off foxes and badgers with his bare teeth, stoically enduring any rare diseases and parasitic infections to which his childhood vaccinations and polyclonal T-cell boosts hadn't granted him immunity. The truth was, he almost certainly would have starved or gone insane, but that wasn't the point. What mattered was the fact that his genes were scarcely different from those of his hunter-gatherer ancestors of 10,000 years before, that air was still breathable and free, that sunshine still flooded the planet, still drove the food chain, still maintained a climate in which he could survive. It wasn't physically impossible, it wasn't biologically absurd to imagine life without money. Watching the screens of his bunker, he'd looked back on that trite but comforting understanding with a dizzying sense of loss, because it was no longer in his power to distance himself, however briefly, from the mass hallucination of commerce as reality, no longer possible to wrench some half self-mocking sense of dignity and independence out of his hypothetical ability to live naked in the woods. Money had ceased to be a convenient fiction to be viewed with appropriate irony, because the computerized financial transactions which flowed from his investments to the network's quips providers now underpinned everything he thought, everything he perceived, everything he was. Oh, Greg Egan never ever change. Oh yeah. Some people live to make money. This guy would literally die if he ran out. Would literally die. Not maybe die. Not probably die. Definitely is toast, ceases to be, reaches terminal mortality. Simply ceases to be run. He will die if he does not make money, or use money, or have money. Because of his unique and awkward position. Well, not quite unique, but awkward position. Anyway, carrying right on. Friendless, bodiless, the entire world he'd once inhabited transformed into nothing but a blur of scenery glimpsed through the window of a high-speed train, David Hawthorne had prepared to bail out. It was Kate who had interrupted him. She'd been delegated to make a welcoming call by a slum dwellers committee, which she'd only joined in the hope that they'd sponsor one of her projects. This was before she'd made the conscious decision not to desire an audience for any of her art, rendering its quota of computing time relative to any other process irrelevant. Hawthorne's only contact since his death had been brief recorded messages from ex-friends, ex-lovers, ex-relations, and ex-colleagues, all more or less bidding him farewell, as if he'd embarked on a one-way voyage to a place beyond the reach of modern communications. There'd also been an offer of counseling from his scanning clinic's resurrection trauma expert system. First 10 subjective minutes absolutely free. When Kate had appeared on his communications screen, synced to his time rate and talking back, he'd poured out his soul to her. She'd persuaded him to postpone bailing out until he'd considered the alternatives. She hadn't had to argue hard. The mere fact of her presence had already improved his outlook immeasurably. Thousands of copies, she'd said, survived with slowdown factors of 30, 60, or worse, playing no part in human society, earning no money but the passive income from their trust funds, living at their own speed, defining their worth on their own terms. He had nothing to lose by trying it himself. And if he couldn't accept that kind of separatist existence, he always had the choice of suspending himself, in the hope that the economics of ontology would eventually shift in his favor, albeit at the risk of waking to find that he'd matched speeds with a world far stranger, far harder to relate to than the present in fast motion. For someone whose fondest hope had been to wake in a robot body and carry on living as if nothing had changed, the slums were a shock. Kate had shown him around the slow clubs, the meeting places for copies willing to sink to the rate of slowest person. Willing to sink. Oh my gosh, let me try that sentence again. Wow. Kate had shown him around the slow clubs, the meeting places for copies willing to sink to the rate of the slowest person present. Not a billionaire in sight. At the Cabaret Andalou, the musicians presented as living saxophones and guitars, songs were visible, tangible, psychotropic radiation blasting from the mouths of the singers. And on a good night, a strong enough sense of camaraderie, telepathy, synergy, could by the mutual consent of the crowd take over, melt. What? Yes, no, I read that correctly. There's a page flip in between, sorry. And on a good night, a strong enough sense of camaraderie, telepathy, synergy, could, by the mutual consent of the crowd, take over, melting away, for a moment, all personal barriers, mental and mock physical, reconstructing audience and performers into a single organism, 100 eyes, 200 limbs, one giant neural net resonating with the memories, perceptions, and emotions of all the people it had been. Kate had shown him some of the environments she'd bought, and some she'd built herself, where she lived and worked in solitude. An overgrown, oversized small town back garden in early summer, an enhanced and modified childhood memory, where she carved solid sculptures out of nothing but the 10 to the 10,000th possibilities of color, texture, and form. A bleak gray stretch of shoreline under eternally threatening clouds, the sky dark oil on canvas, a painting come to life where she went to calm herself when she chose not to make the conscious decision to be calm. She'd helped him redesign his apartment, transforming it from a photorealist concrete box into a system of perceptions which could be as stable or responsive as he wished. Once, before sleep, he'd wrapped the structure around himself like a sleeping bag, shrinking and softening it until the kitchen cradled his head, and the other rooms draped his body. He'd changed the topology so that every window looked in through another window, every wall abutted another wall, the whole thing closed in on itself in every direction, finite but borderless, universe as womb. And Kate had introduced him to Daniel Lebesgue's interactive philosophical plays. The Beholder, The Sane Man, his adaptation of Pirandello's Enrico IV, and of course, Solipsist Nation. Hawthorne had taken the role of John Beckett, a reluctant copy obsessed with keeping track of the outside world, who ends up literally becoming an entire society and culture himself. The play's software hadn't enacted that fate upon Hawthorne. Intended for visitors and copies alike, it worked on the level of perceptions and metaphors, not neural reconstruction. Lebesgue's ideas were Lebesgue's ideas were mesmerizing, but imprecise, and even he had never tried to carry them through, so far as anyone knew. He'd vanished from sight in 2036, becoming a recluse, bailing out or suspending himself, nobody could say. His disciples wrote manifestos and prescriptions for virtual utopias. In the wider vernacular, though, to be solipsist nation simply meant to have ceased deferring to the outside world. 3 subjective weeks, almost 4 real-time years, after his resurrection, Hawthorne had stepped off the merry-go-round long enough to catch up with news from the outside. There'd been nothing especially dramatic or unexpected in the summaries. No shocking political upheavals, no stunning technological breakthroughs, no more nor less civil war or famine than in the past. The BBC's headlines of the day: 500 people had died in storms in southeast England. The European Federation had cut its intake of environmental refugees by 40%. Korean investors had gone ahead with a threatened embargo on U.S. government bonds as part of a trade war over biotechnology tariffs, and utilities had begun disconnecting power, water, and communication services from federal buildings. Up to the minute details notwithstanding, it had all seemed as familiar as some brand name breakfast food. The same texture, the same taste, as he remembered from 8 years before. With his eyes locked on the terminal in front of him, the oddly soothing generic images drawing him in, the 3 hallucinatory weeks of dancing saxophones and habitable paintings had receded into insignificance, as if they'd been nothing but a vivid dream. Or at least something on another channel, with no risk of being mistaken for news. Kate had said, "You know, you can sit there forever. You can sit here forever, watch this forever, if that's what you want. There are copies, we call them witnesses, who refine themselves into systems, which do nothing but monitor the news, as thoroughly as their slowdown allows. No bodies, no fatigue, no distractions. Pure observers, watching history unfold." That's not what I want. He hadn't taken his eyes off the screen, though. Inexplicably, he'd started to cry, softly, grieving for something that he couldn't name. Not the world defined by the news systems. He'd never inhabited that place. Not the people who'd sent him their recorded farewells. They'd been useful at the time, but they meant nothing to him any more. But outside is still what's real to me, even if I can't be a part of it. Flesh and blood, solid ground, real sunlight. It's still the only world that matters in the end. I can't pretend I don't know that. Everything in here is just beautiful, inconsequential fiction. Including you. Including me. Kate had said, "You can change that." Change what? Virtual reality is virtual reality. I can't transform it into something else. You can change your perspective, change your attitudes. Stop viewing your experiences here as less than real. That's easier said than done. Said than done. But it isn't. She'd summoned up a control panel, shown him the software he could use. A program which would analyze his model of a brain, identify his qualms and misgivings about turning his back on the world, and remove them. A do-it-yourself lobotomy. Hardly. There's no physical excision. The program carries out trial and error adjustment of synaptic weights until it finds the minimum possible alteration which achieves the desired goal. A few billion short-lived, stripped-down versions of your brain will be tested and discarded along the way, but don't let that bother you. You've run this on yourself? She'd laughed. Yes, out of curiosity. But it found nothing to change in me. I'd already made up my mind. Even on the outside, I knew this was what I wanted. So, I press a button and there's someone new sitting here? One instant synthetic, satisfied customer? I annihilate myself just like that? You're the one who jumped off a cliff. No, I'm the one who didn't. You won't annihilate yourself. You'll only change as much as you have to. And you'll still call yourself David Hawthorne. What more can you ask for? What more have you ever done? What more have you ever done? They'd talked it through for hours, debating the fine philosophical and moral points, the difference between naturally accepting his situation and imposing acceptance upon himself. In the end, though, when he'd made the decision, it had seemed like just another part of the dream, just another inconsequential fiction. In that sense, the old David Hawthorne had been true to his beliefs, even as he rewired them out of existence. Kate had been wrong about one thing. Despite the perfect continuity of his memories, he'd felt compelled to mark the transition by choosing a new name, plucking the whimsical monosyllable out of thin air. The minimum possible alteration? Perhaps if he had ended up less radically solipsist nation, far more of his personality would have been distorted for him to have been convinced at all. A few bold, necessary cuts had squared the circle, instead of 1,000 finicky mutilations. That first change, though, had cleared the way for many more, a long series of self-directed mutations. Peer, by choice, had no patience with nostalgia or sentimentality. If any part of his personality offended him, he struck it out. Some traits had, most likely, vanished forever, a horde of petty jealousies, vanities, misgivings, and pointless obsessions, a tendency to irrational depression and guilt. Others came and went. Peer had acquired, removed, and restored a variety of talents, mood predispositions and drives, cravings for knowledge, art, and physical experience. In a few subjective ways, in a few subjective days, sorry, in a few subjective days, he could change from an ascetic, bodiless student of Sumerian archaeology to a hedonistic gastronome delighting in nothing more than the preparation and consumption of lavishly simulated feasts, to a disciplined practitioner of Shotokan karate. A core remained. Certain values, certain emotional responses, certain aesthetic sensibilities had survived these transitions unscathed, as had the will to survive himself. Oh, as had the will to survive itself. As had the will to survive itself. I'm not sure how to read that line. Anyway, the will to survive itself was what had survived the transitions unscathed. There we go. Peer had once asked himself, was that kernel of invariance, and the more or less unbroken thread of memory, enough? Had David Hawthorne, by another name, achieved the immortality he'd paid for? Or had he died somewhere along the way? There was no answer. The most that could be said, at any moment, was that someone existed who knew, or believed, that they'd once been David Hawthorne. And so, Peer had made the conscious decision to let that be enough. I like how that chapter is practically its own short story dealing with the ramifications of having the ability to just edit yourself at will. Um, Greg Egan has danced around with that idea in the past before. Um, there's a couple stories in Axiomatic that kind of deal with that, namely the Axiomatic short story itself. Chapter 12. Rip, Tie, Cut Toy Man. June 2045. In case you haven't twigged, the subtitle of the chapters indicates the time frame in which it's happening. Um, Remit, not paucity, is generally going to be stuff happening in or around late 2050 to early 2051. Basically, the portion of the timeline wherein uh, Maria de Luca is working for Paul Durham, and Rip Tie Cut Toy Man is about 5 years earlier, and is generally focused on the Paul Durham copy, who goes by Paul, and refers to the biological meat space Paul Durham as the Jinn, Djinn. I think that's fairly clear by now, but I'm going to make it explicit. Paul switched on the terminal and made contact with his old organic self. The Jinn looked tired and frayed. All the begging and bribery required to set up the latest stage of the experiment must have taken its toll. Paul felt more alive than he'd ever felt, in any incarnation. His stomach was knotted with something like fear, but the electric tingling of his skin felt more like the anticipation of triumph. His body was about to be mutilated, carved up beyond recognition, and yet he knew he would survive, suffer no harm, feel no pain. Squeak! Experiment 3, Trial 0, baseline data, all computations performed by processor clusters number 462, Hitachi Supercomputer Facility, Tokyo. 1, 2, 3. It was nice to be told where he was, at last. Paul had never visited Japan before. 4, 5, 6. And on his own terms, he still hadn't. The view out the window was Sydney, not Tokyo. Why defer to the external geography when it made no difference at all? 7, 8, 9, 10. Squeak! Trial number 1. Mortal partitioned into 500 sections, run on 500 processor clusters, distributed globally. Paul counted. 500 clusters. 5 only for the crudely modeled external world. All the rest were allocated to his body, and most to the brain. He lifted his hand to his eyes, and the information flow that granted him motor control and sight traversed tens of thousands of kilometers of optical cable. There was no perceptible delay. Each part of him simply hibernated when necessary, waiting for the requisite feedback from around the world. It was, of course, pure lunacy, computationally and economically. Paul guessed that he was costing at least 100 times as much as usual. Not quite 500, since each cluster's capacity was only being partly used, and his slowdown factor had probably risen from 17 to as much as 50. Once it had been hoped that devoting hundreds of computers to each copy might improve the slowdown problem, not worsen it. But the bottlenecks in shifting data between processor clusters kept even the richest copies from reducing the factor below 17. It didn't matter how many supercomputers you owned, because splitting yourself between them wasted more time on communications than was saved by the additional computing power. Squeak! Trial number 2, 1,000 sections, 1,000 clusters. Brain the size of a planet, and here I am, counting to 10. Sick Douglas Adams reference, bro. Or Brodette, I don't know. Paul recalled the perennial, naive and paranoid, fear that all the networked computers of the world might one day spontaneously give birth to a global hypermind. But he was, almost certainly, the first planet-sized intelligence on Earth. He didn't feel much like a digital Gaia, though. He felt exactly like an ordinary human being sitting in a room a few meters wide. Squeak! Trial number 3, model partitioned into 50 sections and 20 time sets, implemented on 1,000 clusters. 1, 2, 3. Paul struggled to imagine the outside world on his own terms, but it was almost impossible. Not only was he scattered across the globe, but widely separated machines were simultaneously computing different moments of his subjective time frame. Was the distance from Tokyo to New York now the length of his corpus callosum? Had the world shrunk to the size of his skull and vanished from time altogether, except for the 50 computers which contributed at any one time to what he called the present? Maybe not, although in the eyes of some hypothetical space traveler the whole planet was virtually frozen in time and flat as a pancake. Relativity declared that this point of view was perfectly valid, but Paul's was not. Relativity permitted continuous deformation, but no cutting and pasting. Why not? Because it had to allow for cause and effect. Influences had to be localized, traveling from point to point at a finite velocity. Chop up spacetime and rearrange it, and the causal structure would fall apart. What if you were an observer, though, who had no causal structure? A self-aware pattern appearing by chance in the random twitches of a noise machine, your time coordinate dancing back and forth through causally respectable real time. Why should you be declared a second-class being with no right to see the universe your way? Ultimately, what difference was there between so-called cause and effect and any other internally consistent pattern? Squeak! Trial number 4, model partitioned into 50 sections and 20 time sets, sections and states randomly allocated to 1,000 clusters. 1, 2, 3. Paul stopped counting, stretched his arms wide, stood up slowly. He wheeled around once to examine the room, checking that it was still intact, still complete. Then he whispered, "This is dust, all dust. This room, this moment, is scattered across the planet, scattered across 500 seconds or more. But it still holds itself together. Don't you see what that means?" The djinn reappeared, but Paul didn't give him a chance to speak. The words flowed out of him, unstoppable. He understood. Imagine a universe entirely without structure, without shape, without connections. A cloud of microscopic events, like fragments of space-time, except there is no space or time. What characterizes one point in space for one instant? Just the values of the fundamental particle fields, just a handful of numbers. Now, take away all notions of position, arrangement, order, and what's left? A cloud of random numbers. That's it. That's all there is. The cosmos has no shape at all. No such thing as time or distance, no physical laws, no cause and effect. But if the pattern that is me could pick itself out from all the other events taking place on this planet, why shouldn't the pattern we think of as the universe assemble itself, find itself in exactly the same way? If I can piece together my own coherent space and time from data scattered so widely that it might as well be part of some giant cloud of random numbers, then what makes you think that you're not doing the very same thing? The djinn's expression hovered between alarm and irritation. Squeak? Paul, what's the point of all this? Space-time is a construct. The universe is really nothing but a sea of disconnected events. Assertions like that are meaningless. You can believe it if you want to, but what difference would it make? What difference? We inhabit one arrangement of the set of events. But why should that arrangement be unique? There's no reason to believe that the pattern we've found is the only coherent way of ordering the dust. There must be billions of other universes coexisting with us, made of the very same stuff, just differently arranged. If I can perceive events thousands of kilometers and hundreds of seconds apart to be side by side and simultaneous, there could be worlds and creatures built up from what we'd think of as points in space-time scattered all over the galaxy, all over the universe. We're one possible solution to a giant cosmic anagram, but it would be ludicrous to believe that we're the only one. Squeak? Durham snorted. Cosmic anagram? So where are all the leftover letters? If any of this were true, and the primordial alphabet soup really is random, don't you think it's highly unlikely that we could structure the whole thing? Paul thought about it. We haven't structured the whole thing. The universe is random at the quantum level. Macroscopically, the pattern seems to be perfect. Microscopically, it decays into uncertainty. We've swept the residue of randomness down to the lowest level. Squeak! The djinn strived visibly for patience. Paul, none of this could ever be tested. How would anyone ever observe a planet whose constituent parts were scattered across the universe, let alone communicate with its hypothetical inhabitants? What you're saying might have a certain purely mathematical validity. Grind the universe into fine enough dust, and maybe it could be rearranged in other ways that make as much sense as the original. If those rearranged worlds are inaccessible, though, it's all angels on the heads of pins. How can you say that? I've been rearranged. I've visited another world. Squeak? If you did, it was an artificial world, created, not discovered. Found, created, there's no real difference. Squeak? What are you claiming? Some influence from this other world flowed into the computers, changed the way the model ran? Of course not. Your pattern hasn't been violated. The computers did exactly what was expected of them. That doesn't invalidate my perspective. Stop thinking of explanations, causes and effects. There are only patterns. The scattered events that formed my experience had an internal consistency every bit as real as the consistency in the actions of the computers. And perhaps the computers didn't provide all of it. Squeak? What do you mean? The gaps in experiment 1. What filled them in? What was I made of when the processors weren't describing me? Well, it's a big universe. Plenty of dust to be me in between descriptions. Plenty of events. Nothing to do with your computers, maybe nothing to do with your planet or your epoch, out of which to construct 10 seconds of experience. Squeak? The Djinn looked seriously worried now. You're a copy in a virtual environment under computer control. Nothing more, nothing less. These experiments prove that your internal sense of space and time is invariant. That's exactly what we expected. Remember? Come down to earth. Your states are computed. Your memories have to be what they would have been without manipulation. You haven't visited any other worlds. You haven't built yourself out of fragments of distant galaxies. Paul laughed. Your stupidity is surreal. What did you create me for if you're not even going to listen to what I have to say? I've had a glimpse of the truth behind everything. Space, time, the laws of physics. You can't shrug that off by saying that what happened to me was inevitable. Squeak? Control and subject are still identical. Of course they are. That's the whole point. Like gravity and acceleration in general relativity. It all depends on what you can't tell apart. This is a new principle of equivalence, a new symmetry between observers. Relativity threw out absolute space and time. But it didn't go far enough. We have to throw out absolute cause and effect. Squeak? The Djinn muttered, dismayed. Elizabeth said this would happen. She said it was only a matter of time before you'd lose touch. Paul stared at him, jolted back to the mundane. Elizabeth? You said you hadn't even told her. Squeak? Well, I have now. I didn't tell you because I didn't think you'd want to hear her reaction. Which was? Squeak? I was up all night arguing with her. She wanted me to shut you down. She said I was seriously disturbed to even think about doing this. Paul was stung. What would she know? Ignore her. Squeak? Durham frowned apologetically, an expression Paul recognized at once, and his guts turned to ice. Maybe I should pause you while I think things over. Elizabeth raised some valid ethical questions. I think that I should talk it through with her again. Fuck that. If I'm not here for you to put on ice every time you have a change of heart, and if Elizabeth wants to have a say in my life, she can damn well talk it through with me. Paul could see exactly what would happen. If he was paused, Durham wouldn't restart him. He'd go back to the original scan file and start again from scratch, handling his prisoner differently, hoping to end up with a more cooperative subject. Maybe he wouldn't even perform the first set of experiments at all. The ones which had given him this insight. The ones which had made him who he was. Squeak? I need time to think. It would be only temporary, I promise. It would only be temporary, I promise. No! You have no right! Durham hesitated. Paul felt numb, disbelieving. Some part of him refused to acknowledge any danger, refused to accept that it could be this easy to die. Being paused wouldn't kill him, wouldn't harm him, wouldn't have the slightest effect. What would kill him would be not being restarted. He'd be passively annihilated, ignored out of existence. The fate that befell his own shit. Durham reached off-screen. At least Elizabeth was discussing the ethical ramifications, because they are very present. Greg Egan has dealt with those too, by the way. We're sort of glossing over them a little bit here, though he's paid some lip service to them. Chapter 13: Remit Not Paucity, February 2051. Maria said, "Recalculate everything up to Epoch 5, then show me sunrise on Lambert. Latitude 0, longitude 0, altitude 1." She waited, staring into the blank workspace, fighting the temptation to change her instructions and have the software display every stage of the simulation, which would have slowed things down considerably. After several minutes, a fissured, dark plane appeared, raked with silver light. The unnamed sun, dazzling and swollen, and, so low in the sky, too white by far, turned a chain of extinct volcanoes on the horizon into black silhouettes like a row of pointed teeth. In the foreground, the surface looked glassy, inhospitable. Maria raised her viewpoint to 1,000 meters, then sent it skimming east. The terrain repeated itself, the eerily symmetric cones of the dead volcanoes the only relief from the fractured igneous plains. This specific, detailed scenery was nothing more than a series of computerized artists' impressions, manufactured on demand from purely statistical data about the planet's topography. The simulation itself hadn't dealt with anything so finicky as individual volcanoes. Touring the planet was a wasteful means of finding out anything, but it was hard to resist playing explorer, treating this world as if its secrets had to be deduced painstakingly from its appearance, even when the truth was the exact opposite. Reluctantly, Maria froze the image and went straight to the underlying numerical data. The atmosphere was much too thin, again, and this time there was almost no aqua at all. She backtracked through the simulation's history to see when the aqua had been lost, but this version of Lambert had never possessed significant oceans, or ice caps, or atmospheric vapor. She'd made a slight change in the composition of the primordial gas and dust cloud, increasing the proportion of blue and yellow atoms, in the hope that this would ultimately lead to a denser atmosphere for Lambert. Instead, she'd caused more than half of the debris in the Kuiper belt to condense into a whole new stable outer planet. As a consequence, far fewer ice-rich comets from the belt had ended up striking Lambert, robbing it of its largest source of aqua by far, and much of its atmosphere. Gas released by volcanic eruptions provided a poor substitute. The pressure was far too low, and the chemistry was all wrong. Maria was beginning to wish she'd kept her mouth shut. It had taken her almost an hour on the phone to persuade Durham that it was worth trying to give Lambert a proper astronomical context, and a geological history that stretched back to the birth of its sun. If we present this world as a fait accompli and say, look, it can exist in the autoverse, the obvious response to that will be, yes, it can exist, if you put it there by hand, but that doesn't mean it's ever likely to have formed. If we can demonstrate a range of starting conditions that lead to planetary systems with suitable worlds, that will be one less element of uncertainty to be used against us. Durham had eventually agreed, so she'd taken an off-the-shelf planetary system modeling program, irreverently titled the Laplacian Casino, and adapted it to autoverse chemistry and physics, not the deep physics of the autoverse cellular automaton, but the macroscopic consequences of those rules. Mostly, that came down to specifying the properties of various autoverse molecules, bond energies, melting and boiling points versus pressure, and so on. Aqua was not just water by another name, yellow atoms were not identical to nitrogen, and although some chemical reactions could be translated as if there was a one-to-one correspondence, in the giant fractionating still of a protostellular nebula, subtle differences in relative densities and volatilities could have profound effects on the final composition of each of the planets. There were also some fundamental differences. Since the autoverse had no nuclear forces, the sun would be heated solely by gravitational energy, the velocity in its molecules acquired as the diffuse primordial gas cloud fell in on itself. Oh, sorry. The velocity its molecules acquired. What? Oh, from the graph. Got it, got it, got it. I'm slow. There's a page break there, and it threw me really badly. I'm not understanding what I'm reading, which is embarrassing. This happens sometimes with Greg Egan. He's out there. I couldn't explain some of this stuff to you, and I apologize for that. I read it as best I can. He probably has a an explanation of what's going on for some of this stuff anyway. There were also some fundamental differences. Since the autoverse had no nuclear forces, the sun would be heated solely by gravitational energy, the velocity in its molecules acquired as the diffuse primordial gas cloud fell in on itself. In the real universe, stars unable to ignite fusion reactions ended up as cold, short-lived brown dwarfs. But under autoverse physics, gravitational heating could power a large enough star for billions of years. Units of space and time were not strictly translatable, but everybody but the purists did it. If a red atom's width was taken to be that of hydrogen, and one grid spacing per clock tick was taken as the speed of light, a more or less sensible correspondence emerged. Similarly, although planet Lambert would lack internal heating from radioisotope decay, its own gravitational heat of formation would be great enough to drive tectonic activity for almost as long as the sun shone. Without nuclear fusion to synthesize the elements, their origin remained a mystery, and a convenient gas cloud with traces of all 32, and the right mass and rotational velocity, had to be taken for granted. Maria would have liked to have explored the cloud's possible origins, but she knew the project would never be finished if she kept lobbying Durham to expand the terms of reference. The point was to explore the potential diversity of autoverse life, not to invent an entire cosmology. Gravity in the autoverse came as close as real-world gravity to the classical Newtonian inverse square law for the range of conditions that mattered, so all the usual real-world orbital dynamics applied. At extreme densities, the cellular automaton's discrete nature wouldn't cause it to deviate wildly from Newton, and Einstein, and Chu, but Maria had no intention of peppering her universe with black holes or other exotica. In fact, gravity had been seen as an irrelevant side effect of Lambert's original choice of automaton rules, since running an autoverse large enough for it to make the slightest difference was blatantly impossible, and several people had tried to remove the redundancy while leaving everything else intact. Nobody had succeeded, though. Their rationalized versions had always failed to generate anything remotely like the rich chemistry of the original. A Peruvian mathematician, Ricardo Salazar, had eventually proved that they shouldn't have bothered. The autoverse rules were poised on the border between two radically different levels of algorithmic complexity, and any tinkering in the hope of improved efficiency was necessarily self-defeating. The presence or absence of gravity, in itself, had no bearing on autoverse chemistry, but the roots of both phenomena in the simple automaton rules seemed to be inextricably entwined. Maria was aiming for a star with 4 planets. 3 small worlds, 1 giant. The seed world, Lambert, second from the sun, with a decent-sized moon, if possible. Whether or not tidal pools had been a driving force in real-world evolution, life's bridge from sea to land, and even though the sun itself would cause small tides regardless, it couldn't hurt to make Lambert as generally Earth-like as possible, since Earth was still the only example to turn to for inspiration. With so much about terrestrial evolution still in dispute, the safest policy was to cover every factor which might have been significant. The gravitational effects of the other planets would ensure a reasonably complex set of Milankovitch cycles, minor orbital changes and axis wobbles providing long-term climate variations, ice ages, and interglacials. A belt of comets, geez. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's issue 1 of The Incredible Superman. The Incredible Superbacterium. Sorry. Where were we? A belt of comets and other debris would complete the picture, not merely supplying an atmosphere early on, but also offering the chance of occasional mass extinctions for billions of years to come. The trick was to ensure that all of these supposedly evolution-enhancing features coincided with a version of Lambert which could support the seed organism in the first place. Maria had half a dozen possible modifications to A. lamberti in mind to render it self-sufficient, but she was waiting to see what kind of environments were available before making a final decision. That still left unanswered the question of whether the seed organism, or life of any kind, could have arisen on Lambert, rather than being placed there by human hands. Max Lambert's original reason for designing the Autoverse had been the hope of observing self-replicating molecular systems, primitive life, arising from simple chemical real-world chemistry, simple chemical mixtures. I skipped a line. Sorry. Let's try that sentence again. Max Lambert's original reason for designing the Autoverse had been the hope of observing self-replicating molecular systems, primitive life, arising from simple chemical mixtures. The Autoverse was meant to provide a compromise between real-world chemistry, difficult and expensive to manipulate and monitor in test tube experiments, and hideously slow to compute in faithful simulations, and the tantalizing abstractions of the earliest artificial life. Computer viruses, genetic algorithms, self-replicating machines embedded in simple cellular automaton worlds, all trivially easy to compute, but unable to throw much light on the genesis of real-world molecular biology. Lambert had spent a decade trying to find conditions which would lead to the spontaneous appearance of Autoverse life, without success. He'd constructed A. Lamberti, a 12-year project, to reassure himself that his goal wasn't absurd, to demonstrate that a living organism could at least function in the Autoverse, however it had come to be there. A. Lamberti had permanently sidetracked him. He'd never returned to his original research. Maria had daydreamed about embarking on her own attempt at abiogenesis, but she'd never done anything about it. That kind of work was open-ended. In comparison, any problems with mutations in A. lamberti seemed utterly tractable and well-defined. Excuse me. One sec. And although, in a sense, it went to the heart of what Durham was trying to prove, she was glad he'd chosen to compromise. If he'd insisted on starting his thought experiment with a totally sterile world, the uncertainties in the transition from inanimate matter to the simplest Autoverse life would have overwhelmed every other aspect of the project. She scrapped the desert planet Lambert and returned to the primordial gas cloud. She popped up a gadget full of slider controls and adjusted the cloud's composition, taking back half of the increases she'd made in the proportions of blue and yellow. Planetology by trial and error. The starting conditions for real-world systems with Earth-like planets had been mapped out long ago, but nobody had ever done the equivalent for the Autoverse. Nobody had ever had a reason. Maria felt a flicker of unease. Each time she stopped to remind herself that these worlds would never exist, not even in the sense that a culture of A. lamberti existed. Not even in the sense that a culture of A. lamberti existed. The whole project seemed to shift perspective, to retreat into the distance like a mirage. The work itself was exhilarating, she couldn't have asked for anything more, but each time she forced herself to put it all into context. Not in the Autoverse, but in the real world. She found herself light-headed, disoriented. Durham's reasons for the project were so much flimsier than the watertight internal logic of the thing itself. Stepping back from the work was like stepping off a rock-solid planet and seeing it turn into nothing but a lightly tethered balloon. She stood and walked over to the window and parted the curtains. The street below was deserted. The concrete glowed in the hyper-real glare of the midday sun. Durham was paying her good money, money that would help get Francesca scanned. That was reason enough to press on. And if the project was ultimately useless, at least it did no harm. It was better than working on some hedonistic VR resort or some interactive war game for psychotic children. She let the curtain fall back into place and returned to her desk. The cloud floated in the middle of the workspace, roughly spherical, rendered visible in spite of the fact that its universe was empty of stars. That was a shame. It meant the future citizens of Lambert were destined to be alone. They'd have no prospect of ever encountering alien life, unless they built their own computers and modeled other planetary systems, other biospheres. Maria said, "Recalculate, then show me sunrise again." She waited. And this time, false colors by definition, the disk of the sun was bright cherry red, beneath a thick band of clouds streaked orange and violet, spread across the sky. And the whole scene was repeated, stretched out before her, shimmering, inverted, mirrored in the face of the waters. Thanks for tuning in, Direm Wolf. By a quarter to 8, Maria was thinking about logging off and grabbing some food. She was still on a high, but she could feel how close she was. One sec. Awkward line break. She was still on a high, but she could feel how close she was coming to the. Okay, very good. Not quite a run-on sentence, but very close. By a quarter to 8, Maria was thinking about logging off and grabbing some food. She was still on a high, but she could feel how close she was coming to the point where she'd be useless for the next 36 hours if she pushed herself any further. She'd found a range of starting conditions for the cloud which consistently gave rise to two hospitable versions of Lambert, along with all the astronomical criteria she'd been aiming for. Except for the large satellite, which would have been a nice touch but wasn't critical. Tomorrow she could begin the task of providing A. Lamberti with the means of surviving alone on this world, manufacturing its own neutros from thin air with the help of sunlight. Other workers had already designed a variety of energy-trapping pigment molecules. The literal translation of chlorophyll lacked the right photochemical properties, but a number of useful analogues had been found, and it was a matter of determining which could be integrated into the bacteria's biochemistry with the fewest complications. Bringing photosynthesis to the autoverse would be the hardest part of the project, but Maria felt confident. She'd studied Lambert's notes, and she'd familiarized herself with the full range of techniques he'd developed for adapting biochemical processes to the quirks of autoverse chemistry. And even if the pigment she chose, for the lack of expediency, wasn't the most efficient molecule for the task, as long as the seed organism could survive and reproduce, it would have the potential to stumble on a better solution itself, eventually. The potential, if not the opportunity. She was about to shut down the Laplacian casino when a message appeared in the foreground of the workspace. Juno. Statistical analysis of response times and error rates suggests that your link to the JSN is being monitored. Would you like to switch to a more heavily encrypted protocol? Maria shook her head, amused. It had to be a bug in the software, not a bug on the line. Juno was a public domain program, free, but all donations welcome, which she'd downloaded purely as a gesture of solidarity with the U.S. privacy lobby. Federal laws there still made bug detection software and any half-decent encryption algorithms illegal for personal use, lest the FBI be inconvenienced, so Maria had sent Juno's authors a donation to help them fight the good fight. Actually installing the program had been a joke. The idea of anyone going to the trouble of listening in to her conversations with her mother, or her tedious VR contract work, or her self-indulgent excursions into the autoverse was ludicrous. Still, the joke had to be carried through. She popped up a word processor on the JSN, the terminal's local one wouldn't have shown up to an eavesdropper tapping the fiber, and typed, "Whoever you are, be warned. I'm about to display the Langford mind... Sorry, I'm going to take that from the top. Whoever you are, be warned. I'm about to display the Langford mind-erasing fractal basilisk, so... The doorbell rang. Maria checked the peephole camera's view. There was a woman on the front step, nobody she knew. Early 40s, conservatively dressed. The not-so-subtle giveaway was clearly visible behind her. One compact two-seater Mitsubishi Avalon electric car. The New South Wales Police Department were probably the only people in the world who'd bought that model before the Bankstown factory closed down in '46. Maria had often wondered why they didn't give in and fit blue flashing lights to all their supposedly unmarked cars. Acknowledging the situation would have been more dignified than carrying on as if nobody knew. Dredging her memory, it's kind of like what's that model? Isn't it the Ford Interceptor that the most U.S. police departments used for years, and now they're spreading out? Anyway, totally recognizable. You see one, it's like, oh, it doesn't have flashing lights, but you know what it is. Um, Dredging her memory for recent misdemeanors, but finding none, she hurried downstairs. Maria DeLuca? Yes? I'm Detective Sergeant Hayden, Computer Fraud Squad. I'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's convenient. Maria rescanned for guilty secrets. Still no trace. But she would have preferred a visitor from homicide or armed robbery, someone who'd clearly come to the wrong house. She said, Yes, of course. Come in. Then, as she backed away from the door, I nearly forgot. I suppose I should verify. Hayden, with a thin smile of blatantly insincere approval, let Maria plug her notepad into the socket of her police department badge. The notepad beeped cheerfully. The badge knew the private code which matched the current public key being broadcast by the department. Seated in the living room, Hayden got straight to the point. She displayed a picture on her notepad. Do you know this man? Maria cleared her throat. Yes, his name's Paul Durham. I'm working for him. He's given me some contract programming. She felt no surprise, just the jolt of being brought down to earth. Of course the fraud squad were interested in Durham. Of course the whole fantasy of the last 3 months was about to unravel before her eyes. Aidan had warned her. She'd known it herself. It was a dream contract, too good to be true. An instant later, though, she backed away from that reaction, furious with herself. Durham had paid the money into the trust fund, hadn't he? He'd met the costs of her new JSN account. He hadn't cheated her. Too good to be true was idiot fatalism. Two consenting adults had kept all their promises to each other. The fact that no outsider would understand the transaction didn't make it a crime. And after all he'd done for her, at the very least she owed him the benefit of the doubt. Hayden said, What kind of contract programming? Maria did her best to explain without taking all night. Hayden was, not surprisingly, reasonably computer literate, and even knew what a cellular automaton was, but either she hadn't heard of the Autoverse, or she wanted to hear it all again from Maria. So you believe this man's paying you $30,000 to help him state his position on a purely theoretical question about artificial life? Maria tried not to sound defensive. I've spent tens of thousands of dollars on the Autoverse myself. It's like a lot of other hobbies. It's a world unto itself. People can get obsessive, extravagant. It's no stranger than building model airplanes or reenacting battles from the American Civil War. Hayden didn't argue the point, but she seemed unmoved by the comparisons. Did you know that Paul Durham sold insurance to copies? I knew he was an insurance salesman. He told me that himself. Just because he's not a professional programmer doesn't mean he can't. Did you know he was also trying to sell his clients shares in some kind of sanctuary? A place to go, or to send a clone, in case the political climate turned against them? Maria blinked. No. What do you mean? A sanctuary? A privately owned supercomputer? He's been trying to raise money? Form a consortium? Hayden said flatly, He's certainly raising money, but I doubt he'll ever raise enough to purchase that kind of hardware. Oh, sorry. But I doubt he'll ever raise enough to purchase the kind of hardware he'd need. I can't talk right now. I'm sorry. This happens sometimes, and I apologize. I'm sorry that you got to see this live, and he's falling apart. He's melting. He has no mouth, and he must narrate. He's certainly raising money, but I doubt he'll ever raise enough to purchase the kind of hardware he'd need for the kind of service he's offering. So what are you accusing him of doing? Embarking on a business venture which you don't happen to believe will be successful? Hayden said nothing. Have you spoken to him about this? There might be some simple explanation for whatever you've been told. Some senile copy might have taken his sales pitch for a perpetuity fund the wrong way. Senile copy? Well, some post-dementia scan file might have proved resistant to the cognitive repair algorithms. Hayden said, "Of course we've spoken to him. He's refused to cooperate. He won't discuss the matter. That's why we're hoping you'll be able to assist us." Maria's defiant optimism wavered. If Durham had nothing to hide, why would he refuse to defend himself? She said, "I don't see how I can help you. If you think he's been misleading his clients, go talk to his clients. It's their testimony you need, not mine." There was an awkward pause. Then Hayden said, "The testimony of a copy has no standing. Legally, they're just another kind of computer software." Maria opened her mouth to reply, then realized that any excuse she offered would only make her sound more foolish. She salvaged some pride with the silent observation that the legal position of copies was so farcical that any sane person could have trouble keeping it in mind. There we go. Hayden continued. Durham could be charged with defrauding the executors of the estates by means of supplying misleading data to the software they used to advise them. There are precedents for that. It's like publishing false prospectus information that causes automated share buying programs to buy your stock. But there's still the question of evidence. Wow, imagine if we actually did something about that, right? Imagine if we did something about that. Sorry. I'm not saying we should burn Wall Street to the ground, but man, it ain't working. It's an ecosystem unto itself. Not that I'm not taking advantage of it. There are precedents for that. It's like publishing false prospectus information that causes automated share buying programs to buy your stock. But there's still the question of evidence. We can interview copies as an informal source of information to guide an investigation, but nothing they say will stand up in court. Maria recalled an episode of The Unclear Family where a similar problem had arisen. Babette and Larry Unclear had witnessed bank accounts being pilfered when the relevant data trail had, inexplicably, taken solid form as an accusing tableau of ice sculptures in their cyber suburban backyard. There we go. She couldn't recall exactly how the plot had turned out. The 10-year-old Leroy had probably done something marginally illegal, but morally unimpeachable, to trick the thieves into giving themselves away to the authorities. She said, "I don't know what you expect me to tell you. Durham hasn't defrauded me, and I don't know anything about this scheme." "But you're working on it with him." "I certainly am not." Hayden said dryly, "You're designing a planet for him. What do you think that's for?" Maria stared at her blankly for a second, then almost laughed. "I'm sorry, I can't have explained things very well. I'm designing a planet that could exist in the Autoverse, in the broadest sense of the word. It's a mathematical possibility, but it's too large to be run on a real computer. It's not some VR—" Hayden cut her off. "I understand that perfectly. That doesn't mean Durham's clients would have grasped the distinction. Technical details about the Autoverse aren't exactly general knowledge." "True." Maria hesitated. "But it still makes no sense. For a start, these people would have advisors, researchers, who tell them that anyone promising them an Autoverse planet was full of shit. And why would Durham offer them an Autoverse planet covered in primordial slime when he could offer them a standard set of VR environments, which would be 1,000 times more attractive and 1,000 times more plausible?" "I believe he's offering them both. He's hired an architect in the US to work on the VR part." "But why both? Why not just VR? You couldn't fit a single copy into the Autoverse, and if you did, it would die on the spot. It would take 50 or 60 years of research to translate human biochemistry into Autoverse terms." "They wouldn't know that." "They could find out in 10 seconds flat. Forget about advisors. It would take one to call a knowledge miner. Total cost $5. Oh, sorry. It would take one call to a knowledge miner. Total cost $5. So why tell a lie that could be so easily uncovered? What's the advantage, from a copy's point of view, of an Autoverse planet over Patchwork VR?" Hayden was unfazed. "You're the Autoverse expert, so you tell me." "I don't know." Maria stood up. She was beginning to feel claustrophobic. She hated having strangers in the house. Can I get you something to drink? Tea? Coffee? No, but you go ahead. Maria shook her head and sat down again. She had a feeling that if she went into the kitchen, she wouldn't want to return. She couldn't see why Durham would refuse to talk to the police, unless he was involved in something dubious enough to have him thrown out of his job, at the very least. Fuck him. He might not have intended to cheat her, but he'd screwed her nonetheless. She wouldn't get a cent for the work she'd completed. Other creditors would have no call on the trust fund if Durham merely went bankrupt, but if the money was proceeds of crime... Lorenzo the Magnificent. Yeah. The worst of it was, for all she knew, Hayden believed she was a willing accomplice. And if Durham intended to remain silent, she'd have to clear her own name. How? First, she had to find out about the scam and untangle her role in it. She said, "What exactly is he promising to these copies?" "A refuge. A place where they'll be safe from any kind of backlash, because they won't be connected to the outside world. No telecommunications, nothing to trace. He feeds them a long spiel about the coming dark age, when the unwashed masses will no longer put up with being lorded over by rich immortals, and evil socialist governments will confiscate all the supercomputers for weather control." Hayden seemed to find the prospect laughable. Maria suspended judgment. What mattered was how Durham's clients felt, and she could imagine Operation Butterfly making a lot of copies feel threatened. "So they send their clones in and slam the door in case the originals don't make it through the purges. But then what? How long is this dark age supposed to last?" Hayden shrugged. "Who knows? Hundreds of years? Presumably Durham himself, or some trustworthy successor several generations later, will decide when it's safe to come out. The two copies whose executors filed complaints didn't wait to hear the whole scenario. They threw him out before he could get down to details like that." "He must have approached other copies." "Of course. No one else has come forward, but we have a tentative list of names, all with estates incorporated overseas, unfortunately. I haven't been able to interview any of them yet. We're still working on the jurisdictional red tape. But a few have made it clear already, through their lawyers, that they won't be willing to discuss the matter, which presumably means they've swallowed Durham's line, and now they don't want to hear a word against him." Maria struggled to imagine it. No communications. Cut off from reality. Indefinitely. A few solipsist nation copies might relish the prospect, but most of them had too little money to be the targets of an elaborate scam. And even if Durham's richest, most paranoid clients seriously believed that the world was on the verge of turning against them, what if things went so badly wrong outside that links were never restored? The humans guarding the sanctuary could die out, or just walk away. How could any but the most radically separatist of copies face the risk of being stranded inside a hidden computer, buried in the middle of a desert somewhere, with no means of discovering for themselves when civilization was worth rejoining, and no means of initiating contact in any case? Radioisotope power sources could run for thousands of years. Multiply redundant hardware of the highest standard. Oh, because there's a line break. I don't know how to read. It's okay.
Curse you, Greg Egan, for making me read large words and intelligent phrases. It makes it hard on me.
Radioisotope power sources could run for thousands of years. Multiply redundant hardware of the highest standard could last almost as long, in theory. All these copies would have, to remember reality by, would be the information they'd brought in with them at the start. If it turned into a one-way trip, they'd be like interstellar colonists, carrying a snapshot of Earth culture off into the void. Except that interstellar colonists would merely face a growing radio time lag, not absolute silence. And whatever they were leaving behind, at least they'd have something to look forward to, a new world to explore. A new world, and the possibility of new life. So what better cure for claustrophobia than the promise of dragging an entire planet into the refuge, seeded with the potential for developing its own exotic life? Maria didn't know whether to be outraged or impressed. If she was right, she had to admire Durham's sheer audacity. When he had asked for a package of results that would persuade the skeptics about prospects for an autoverse biosphere, he hadn't been thinking of academics in the artificial life scene. He'd wanted to convince his clients that, even in total isolation, they'd have everything reality could ever offer the human race, including a kind of space exploration, complete with the chance of alien contact. And these would be genuine aliens, not the stylish designer creatures from VR games, constructs of nothing but the human psyche, not the slick, unconvincing biomorphs of the high level phenotype selection models, the Darwinian equivalent of Platonic ideals. Life which had come the whole tortuous way, molecule by molecule, just like the real thing. Or almost the whole way. With abiogenesis still poorly understood, Durham had had enough sense to start with handmade microbes. Otherwise, his clients might never have believed that the planet would bear life at all. Maria explained the idea tentatively. He'd have to have convinced these copies that running the autoverse is much faster than modeling real biochemistry, which it is, without being too specific about the actual figures. And I still think it's a crazy risk to take. Anyone could easily find out the truth. Hayden thought it over. Would it matter if they did? If the point of this world is mainly psychological, a place to escape to if the worst happens, and reality becomes permanently inaccessible, then it wouldn't matter how slowly it ran. Once they'd given up hope of re-establishing contact, slowdown would become irrelevant. Yes, but they're slow, and there's physically impossible. Sure, they could take in a crude sketch of the planet, which is what Durham's asked me to provide, but they wouldn't have a fraction of the memory needed to bring it to life. And even if they found a way around that, it could take 1 billion years of autoverse time before the seed organism turned into anything more exciting than blue-green algae. Multiply that by a slowdown of 1 trillion. I think you get the picture. Flat batteries? Flat batteries? Flat universe. Hayden said, yeah, it just stretches way out. The curve there, the time frame, is long. Flat universe is right. Hayden said, still, if they don't want to think too seriously about the prospect of ending up permanently trapped, they might not want to look too closely at any of this. Thanks to you, Durham will have a thick pile of impressive technical details that he can wave in their faces, convincing enough to take the edge of their fear of cabin fever. Oh, that's of when it should be off, sorry. Convincing enough to take the edge off their fear of cabin fever. Maybe that's all they want. The only part that matters, if everything goes smoothly, is the conventional VR, good enough to keep them amused for a couple of real-time centuries, and that checks out perfectly. Maria thought this sounded too glib by far, but she let it pass. What about the hardware? How does that check out? It doesn't. There'll never be any hardware. Durham will vanish long before he Durham will vanish long before he has to produce it. Vanish with what? Money handed over with no questions asked? No safeguards? No guarantees? Hayden smiled knowingly. Money handed over, mostly, for legitimate purposes. He's commissioned a VR city. He's commissioned an autoverse planet. He's entitled to take a percentage of the fees. There's no crime in that, so long as it's disclosed. For the first few months, everything he does will be scrupulously honest. Then, at some point, he'll ask his backers to pay for a consultant's report, say a study of suitably robust hardware configurations. Tenders will be called for. Some of them will be genuine, but the most attractive one will be forged. Later, Durham will claim to have received the report, the consultants will be paid, and he'll never be seen again. Maria said, You're guessing. You have no idea what his plans are. We don't know the specifics, but it will be something along those lines. Maria slumped back in her chair. So, what now? What do I do? Call Durham and tell him the whole thing's off? Absolutely not. Keep working as if nothing had happened. But try to make contact with him more often. Find excuses to talk to him. See if you can gain his trust. See if you can get him to talk about his work, his clients, the refuge. Maria was indignant. I don't remember volunteering to be your informant. Hayden said coolly, It's up to you, but if you're not willing to cooperate, that makes our job very difficult. There's a difference between cooperation and playing unpaid spy. Hayden almost smiled. If you're worried about money, you'll have a far better chance of being paid if you help us to convict Durham. Why? What am I meant to do? Try suing him after he's already gone bankrupt, repaying the people he's cheated? You won't have to sue him. The court is almost certain to award you compensation as one of the victims, especially if you've helped bring the case to trial. There's a fund, revenue from fines. It doesn't matter whether Durham can pay you himself. Maria digested that. The truth was, it still stank. What she wanted to do was cut her losses and walk away from the whole mess. Pretend it had never happened. And then what? Go crawling back to Aden for money? There were still no jobs around. She couldn't afford to write off 3 months' work. A few $1,000s wouldn't get Francesca scanned, but the lack of it could force her to sell the house sooner than she wanted to. She said, "What if I make him suspicious? If I suddenly start asking all these questions?" "Just keep it natural. Anyone in your position would be curious. It's a strange job he's given you. He must expect questions. And I know you went along with what he told you at the start, but that doesn't mean you can't have given it more thought and decided that there are a few things that still puzzle you." Maria said, "All right, I'll do it." Had she ever had a choice? "But don't expect him to tell me the truth. He's already lied to me. He's not going to change his story now." "Maybe not. But you might be surprised. He might be desperate to have someone to take into his confidence, someone to boast to. Or he might just drop a few oblique hints. Anything's possible as long as you keep talking to him." When Hayden had left, Maria sat in the living room, too agitated to do anything but run through the whole exchange again in her head. An hour before she'd been exhausted, but triumphant. Now she just felt weary and stupid. Keep working as if nothing had happened. The thought of tackling photosynthesis in A. Lamberti, for the sake, now, of ingratiating herself with the fraud squad, was so bizarre it made her giddy. It was a pity Durham hadn't been honest with her and invited her in on the scam. If she'd known all along that she was meant to be helping to screw rich copies out of all their petty cash, not all their petty cash. If she'd known all along that she was meant to be helping to screw rich copies out of their petty cash, at least the work would have had the real-world foundation she'd always felt was missing. She finally went upstairs, without having eaten. Her connection to the JSN had been logged off automatically, but the message from Juno, locally generated, still hovered in the workspace. As she gestured to the terminal to switch itself off, she wondered if she should have asked Hayden, "Is it you who's been tapping my phone line?" All right, and with that, we are going to call it for today. We still have plenty of book left in front of us. We're at about the halfway point, give or take. Give or take. Let's see, where's page 200? Or thereabouts. Or thereabouts, he said, looking at a chapter that just won't end. Thank you, chapter that just won't end. No, seriously, this chapter does not quit. Oh, yeah. Things are going to start getting more complicated. You can already see, like, looking back, you can see that there's foundations for some really wild ideas going forward. We're going places. All right, I plopped that in. Plop that one in, and I'm going to plop in another one in case that proves too long, because next week's going to be just a mess, and I may be tapped out. So I will have contingencies. Anyway, that will do it for this Wednesday. This Friday, we are still looking forward to some more of The Dark Forest by Shijin Liu. We finally get the plot underway. Finally, the plot underway. At last. It will begin. Next Monday, we will continue reading more of Yukikaze by Chohei Kambayashi. The first installment was not especially navel gazing, but we'll be getting into it. There's some interesting philosophical questions that will be raised through the course of that book. I'm looking forward to reading that one aloud. I hope other people are, even though the text is very dense, very detail heavy. It's actually kind of like reading a William Gibson novel in that regard. William Gibson. I'm having a very hard time producing certain specific lip-oriented consonants right now. I'm tired. That's all. It's been a long week, and it's going to keep being a long week. It's like reading William Gibson in that it is very detail heavy. There's lots of extraneous detail, seemingly extraneous. Some of it's actually very relevant, but lots of detail to flesh things out. It's well written in that regard. It's like you know what's going on. Um, it's described very, very intricately. Anyway, that will do it for today. I've said that 4 times now. I'm going to dip. Stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other. Next Wednesday, actually, we will be doing a short story, a festive short story, because it will be ye old Xmas time. So I'll do my part to I'll throw my salvo, my handmade Molotov cocktail, in the war against Christmas. So there. We already threw a couple firebombs a couple years back, when I did. Oh gosh, what was that one called? I think it was called A Silent Night. That one is so with the nanomachine colony that pops up every single year, posing as Santa Claus, that a group of corporate commandos have to go out and kill every single year. They have to kill Santa. So it's a whole thing. It's fun. Anyway, I'm gonna leave you all with that lovely thought. This one will not be that one. This one's gonna be something else entirely. If I can find it, where'd I put it? Oh no. Oh, there it is. Um, it's a short story by Charles Stross. Um, it's nominally part of a broader series he has written. I forget what the series is called. I think it's the Laundry series. Yeah, Laundry series. The Laundry, with a capital L. And it's about an organization that does certain things. Anyway, with that, we will call it, and I will leave you all to your business. I will see you all later. Until then, toodaloo. If I am unable to make one of these, I probably am not going to know until the day of. So if on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday at 12 noonish, U.S. East Coast time, UTC -5, I am not there, sorry. Uh, it will have been probably me dealing with a minor emergency. It should not be a problem for next Wednesday at the very least. Monday we'll see. Friday we'll also see. Monday is the one that might be tricky, but I will find out the hard way. There may be some interruptions, but I'll try to get it done. I had no technical issues this time around. I'm not sure why. I'm not complaining, but they didn't happen. If I could narrow down why they were occurring, it would be great. I suspect it's a Windows update issue, where Windows is trying to scan for updates, even though I've told it not to do that. Or possibly something else, or an interaction with OBS Studio being problematic, not liking that I'm doing a hard amount of upload for like 2 hours at a whack, but it doesn't happen at a reliable time frame or data transmission amount. If it happened like, oh, every time you reach X amount of data transmitted, it's going to be a problem. It's like, oh, okay, I can diagnose this. It doesn't do that. So I've done some troubleshooting. There's more that I can do, and I will continue to do. With that, I'm going to leave you. I did the stay safe, stay sane, be decent to each other, and if for some reason I don't see you, happy holidays. I won't see any of you, but if I don't talk at you, make mouth noises, screaming into the void, static translated into data, vibrations from my throat box that have received impulses from my neuronal structure that have vibrated into a reception device, which is converting it into data, which is then being beamed to the internet, which is then being stored on the internet, which incidentally costs nobody actually asks the question how much money. It's a lot. Uh, and resources and energy. This is all getting saved theoretically in perpetuity. It's very short sighted. I'm contributing to the decline of the planet. I realize this, and it's okay. It's not okay. It's awful, but we're doing it anyway, and you're getting interesting books out of the deal. So why are you complaining? Huh? 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 Why? No, you're not complaining. I'm not complaining. Nobody's complaining. Everybody's complaining. Have you noticed that I've had coffee? I haven't had coffee. You've had coffee. I haven't had coffee actually. I motor mouth when I get tired. Anyway, plenty more Greg Egan in our future, distant and otherwise. So if you're liking Permutation City, or if you liked Quarantine, there is more on the horizon. Although it is a very long horizon, because I am reading so many books at once any given week. A minimum of 3 different books a week are being read, which makes it tricky for me to keep track, but it works. I'm glad people appear to be enjoying it. I'm glad people are tuning in. I'm glad people are watching them after the fact. If you ever want to communicate with me until I get some sort of means of actual communication up, more real-time communication, just thoughts. Leave your thoughts in comments or what have you, or tune in and say them to me live. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not looking for any parasocial relationship angst, agonies, what have you. I've read horror stories, many horror stories. Um, but I'm not worried about it here. I'm too niche to matter. Oh, thank goodness. To be too niche to matter. Such a lovely, lovely way to be. Anyway, I'm having fun. I'll keep doing this regardless, of anything else. Because it's fun. It's a hobby. It is non-profit. We do not do this for remuneration. We do it for, I don't know, self-aggrandizement, maybe? Maybe that's it, self-aggrandizement. Anyway, I will see you all later.